$20, says she freezes when the first round cracks over her head. Staff Sergeant Vance kept his voice low, but not low enough. Corporal Jennings laughed and pulled a crumpled bill from his pocket, slapping it into Vance's palm. Deal. I give her 3 days before she requests transfer back to Germany. The two men stood near the supply depot, their eyes tracking combat medic Kira Thorne as she checked her aid bag for the 4th time that morning. The canyon wind carried their words across the gravel staging area, and she heard every syllable. The Karangal Valley spread before her like a wound in the earth, steep ridges of brown rock rising on both sides of a narrow corridor that had swallowed more American blood than any other piece of ground in Afghanistan. Forward Operating Base Phoenix perched on the eastern ridge, a collection of concrete barriers and sandbag walls that housed 200 soldiers who patrolled the most dangerous terrain in the province. Kira had arrived 6 days ago, and in those 6 days, she had counted 17 separate comments about her capability, 9 pointed questions about her combat experience, and 1 formal suggestion from the senior medic that she might be better suited for the aid station. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you know someone who served as a combat medic in a place like this. Captain Aldrich approached her position with the unhurried stride of a man who had made up his mind before the conversation started. His desert camouflage was faded nearly white from months in the sun, and his expression carried the permanent squint of someone who had seen too many things he would never forget. "Thorne," he said, stopping close enough that nearby soldiers could hear. "You understand the casualty rate in this valley. We lose medics at twice the rate of standard infantry, even the experienced ones." He waited, his weathered hands resting on his body armor, clearly expecting her to take the exit he was offering. His eyes flicked to the aid bag at her feet, then back to her face, measuring something he had already decided was insufficient. "I understand, sir," she said. Her voice stayed level, neutral, giving him nothing to work with. The captain's jaw tightened slightly, disappointment or frustration. She could not tell which. He glanced at Sergeant First Class Merrick, the senior medic who stood 20 feet away pretending not to listen. Merrick was a 15-year veteran with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for keeping soldiers alive through situations that should have killed them. He had made his opinion of female combat medics clear during her first briefing, not through open hostility, but through careful questions about her trauma training, her experience with mass casualty situations, her understanding of tactical movement under fire. Each question framed to emphasize the gap between what she had done and what this place would demand. Captain Aldrich lowered his voice slightly. "I have standing authorization to reassign any medic I believe is not prepared for this operational environment. No mark on your record, just a transfer to Bagram where you can gain more experience." The offer hung between them like a physical thing, and she understood exactly what it represented. Every soldier within earshot stopped what they were doing, waiting to see if the new medic would take the escape route being offered. Specialist Garrett paused in the middle of cleaning his rifle, his hands motionless on the bolt carrier. Private First Class Dixon looked up from the maps he was studying, his expression carefully neutral, but his attention completely focused. They wanted to know if she would fold. "I appreciate the offer, sir," Kira said, "but I came here to do the job I was trained for." She kept her eyes on the captain, refusing to look at the soldiers watching, refusing to acknowledge that this moment was anything more than a simple conversation. The captain held her gaze for 3 long seconds, then nodded once and walked away. The sound of his boots on gravel faded toward the operations center, and the normal noise of the base slowly resumed. Rifles clicked. Conversation started again. But Garrett and Dixon exchanged a look that needed no words, and Vance muttered something to Jennings that ended with the word weak. The mountains swallowed the afternoon sun early, throwing the valley into premature twilight. Kira finished her equipment check and moved toward the transient tent where she would spend her last night before joining 1st Platoon on patrol. The tent smelled of dust and unwashed bodies, a combination that had become normal faster than she expected. Her bunk was in the corner, her gear arranged with a methodical precision that had become second nature during training. A bag, rifle, body armor, helmet, Everything positioned for instant access, everything checked and rechecked until the movements became automatic. Merrick appeared in the tent entrance, his silhouette dark against the fading light. "You pull security duty tonight, 0200 to 0400. North Tower." He did not wait for acknowledgement, just turned and left, his boots crunching away across the compound. The assignment was deliberate, she knew. The graveyard shift on the coldest watch, testing whether she would complain, testing whether she was different from the soldiers who did not require special consideration. She pulled on her jacket and checked her watch. For hours until her shift. For hours to rest in a place where rest never felt complete, where every sound carried the possibility of incoming fire, where the knowledge of what tomorrow would bring made sleep feel like a tactical error. Tomorrow she would patrol into the canyon for the first time. Tomorrow the betting would be settled, one way or another. The patrol briefing started at 0530, when the sky was still dark and the temperature had dropped low enough that breath formed visible clouds in the operations center. First platoon assembled around a tactical map spread across a plywood table. 18 soldiers in various states of alertness, their faces still creased from sleep or from no sleep at all. Lieutenant Baxter stood at the head of the table, a compact officer with the kind of intensity that made people pay attention even when he spoke quietly. He tapped the map with 2 fingers, indicating a route that wound through the southern approach to the canyon. "We patrol south along Route Crimson to Checkpoint Delta, then sweep west through the valley floor before returning via the northern ridge. Intel reports possible weapons cache in the abandoned compound at Grid 7429. We investigate, catalog, and report. Standard pattern." He looked up, his eyes moving across the assembled soldiers until they found Kira standing near the back. "Thorne, you are with 2nd Squad. Stay with Sergeant Wallace at all times. Do not move forward without explicit authorization. Do not engage unless fired upon. Do not make decisions without consulting Wallace first. Understood?" "Understood, sir," she said. Around the room, several soldiers shifted their weight. Specialist Garrett leaned toward Private First Class Dixon and whispered something that made Dixon's mouth twitch into an almost smile. Sergeant Wallace himself, a veteran of 4 deployments with a scar running from his left eyebrow into his hairline, looked at her with an expression that suggested profound skepticism mixed with resignation. He had not asked for a new medic. He had not asked for any medic who required special instructions during mission briefings. Lieutenant Baxter continued with the briefing, detailing rally points and fire support coordinates, outlining rules of engagement and extraction protocols. Kira listened and committed every detail to memory, aware that 18 pairs of eyes kept finding their way back to her, measuring, evaluating, waiting for some sign that would confirm what they already believed. When the briefing ended, soldiers filed out into the pre-dawn darkness to collect their gear and prepare for movement. Kira followed, keeping her distance, not forcing conversation with men who had already decided conversation was not worth the effort. The motor pool was organized chaos, soldiers checking weapons and adjusting body armor, squad leaders conducting final equipment inspections, the battalion tactical operations center broadcasting radio checks that crackled through the cold air. Kira found 2nd Squad assembled near the last Humvee in the convoy, for soldiers who moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this exact routine 100 times before. Sergeant Wallace looked up as she approached, his weathered face unreadable in the gray light. "You carry standard load," he said. "No extra weight. If we move fast, you move fast. If we take contact, you stay down until I tell you otherwise. You do not play hero. You do not freelance. You do exactly what I say when I say it." His voice was not unkind, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. And underneath that authority was the clear assumption that she would be a liability, a problem to be managed rather than an asset to be utilized. "Roger, Sergeant," she said. She checked her A-bag one more time, verifying the placement of tourniquets and chest seals and hemostatic gauze, making sure everything was exactly where her hands would expect to find it. Corporal Chun, the squad's machine gunner, watched her with frank curiosity, his eyes tracking her movements as if trying to determine whether she actually knew what she was doing. Private First Class Torres, the youngest member of the squad at 19 years old, looked nervous about the patrol in general and about her presence specifically, though he tried to hide both anxieties behind an expression of studied indifference. The convoy rolled out at 0600, 6 Humvees loaded with soldiers and weapons, moving in tactical formation down the crude road that led from the FOB into the valley floor. Kira sat in the back of the fourth vehicle, wedged between her aid bag and a spare ammunition can, feeling every bump and pothole as they descended into terrain where the Taliban controlled everything that the Americans did not currently occupy. The morning sun broke over the eastern ridge, throwing long shadows across the valley, illuminating brown hills that held 1,000 hiding places and 10,000 opportunities for ambush. Route Crimson was barely a road, more like a suggestion of a path worn into the earth by years of foot traffic and the occasional vehicle brave or foolish enough to drive through terrain that belonged to no one and everyone. The convoy moved slowly, methodically, gunners scanning the ridgelines while drivers navigated around rocks and washed-out sections. The radio maintained a steady stream of status reports and negative contact updates. The voice of the Tactical Operations Center distant and mechanical, a reminder that somewhere people sat in air-conditioned rooms and tracked their progress on digital maps. They reached Checkpoint Delta without incident, a small fortified position manned by a fire team that looked exhausted and relieved to see fresh faces. The platoon dismounted and formed a patrol formation, squads spreading out in tactical spacing as they prepared to move on foot through the valley floor. Sergeant Wallace gathered second squad with a hand gesture, no words needed. Kira positioned herself where she had been told to position herself, in the middle of the formation, protected by soldiers front and rear, kept away from point position where her inexperience could get people killed. "You ever patrol in mountains before?" Corporal Chun asked as they waited for the order to move. His tone was conversational, but his eyes were serious, genuinely curious whether she had any idea what she was walking into. "Not like these," she admitted. "Training at Fort Benning. Sometime in Colorado. Nothing like this." Chin nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that this answer confirmed exactly what he had expected to hear. "Stay close to Wallace," he said. "Do what he says. You'll be fine." The words were meant to be encouraging, but underneath them was the clear implication that being fine depended entirely on following instructions, on not trying to prove anything, on accepting that she was the least experienced person in a place, where experience was the difference between going home and going home in a box. The patrol moved through the valley floor in tactical silence, each soldier maintaining a 5-meter interval, weapons pointed outward in overlapping fields of fire. The terrain was deceptive, appearing flat from a distance, but revealing itself as a maze of dried creek beds and rocky outcroppings that provided endless concealment for anyone watching. Kira kept pace with Sergeant Wallace, her eyes scanning the ridge lines like she had been taught, looking for the telltale signs of observation posts or fighting positions. The weight of her aid bag pulled at her shoulders, but she adjusted her stride and ignored the discomfort. Complaining was not an option. Showing weakness was not an option. She was here to prove she belonged, and that proof would come through silent competence, not through words. They had been moving for 40 minutes when Private First Class Torres stumbled on loose rock and went down hard, his left ankle twisting beneath him with a sound that carried in the still air. He tried to catch himself, but his momentum carried him forward, and he landed on his side with his rifle underneath him. The patrol halted immediately, soldiers taking knee and establishing security while Torres struggled to sit up, his face tight with pain and embarrassment. Sergeant Wallace appeared at Torres's side within seconds. "How bad?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. Torres tried to put weight on the ankle and immediately sucked air through his teeth, his jaw clenching. "Bad enough, Sergeant." Wallace looked back toward Kira and gestured once, a short, economical movement that meant come here now. She moved forward quickly, dropping to one knee beside Torres and lowering her aid bag. "Let me see it," she said. Torres nodded and extended his leg, his boots still laced tight. She worked the laces loose with practiced movements, her fingers efficient and sure, then eased the boot off slowly while supporting his calf. The ankle was already swelling, a visible bulge forming on the lateral side. She palpated carefully, feeling for displacement or abnormal movement, watching Torres's face for pain responses that would indicate fracture versus sprain. "Can you flex your foot?" she asked. Torres tried and managed limited movement, wincing but completing the range of motion. She tested dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, then checked capillary refill in his toes. "Grade 2 sprain," she said, looking up at Wallace. "No fracture. He can walk with support and wrapping." Wallace studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then looked at Torres. "You good to continue?" he asked. Torres nodded immediately, trying to hide the pain, but not succeeding completely. "I am good, Sergeant. Just need a minute." Kira pulled elastic bandaging from her aid bag and wrapped the ankle with firm compression, creating support that would allow limited mobility. She worked quickly, her movements precise, then helped Torres pull his boot back on over the wrap. The boot provided additional stability, and when Torres stood with her support, he managed to bear weight with only moderate discomfort. Corporal Chun had been watching the entire process from his security position 10 meters away. His expression had changed from skepticism to something closer to surprise. "She knows what she is doing," he said quietly to Private First Class Dixon, who was pulling rear security. Dixon glanced back, saw Torres standing and preparing to continue, then nodded slowly. "Maybe," he replied, "but this is not combat. Wait until rounds start flying. Then we will see." The patrol resumed, moving slower now to accommodate Torres's limited mobility. Kira stayed close to him, monitoring his gait for signs of increasing pain or instability. The canyon walls rose higher on both sides as they moved deeper into the valley, creating a natural funnel that made her skin prickle with awareness of how exposed they were. Every boulder could hide a firing position. Every ridge could conceal an observation post. The Taliban owned these mountains, and the Americans were just visitors who came during daylight and left before the darkness made them targets. They reached the abandoned compound at grid 7429 just after 0800. The structure was typical of rural Afghan architecture, mud brick walls surrounding a central courtyard. Most of the roof collapsed from years of neglect or from fighting that had swept through the area in previous deployments. Lieutenant Baxter positioned squads and security, while a foreman team moved forward to clear the compound and search for the reported weapons cache. Kira took position behind a low rock wall with second squad, her rifle pointed toward the northern ridge, her eyes scanning for movement. "Think she will hold up when it gets real?" Specialist Garrett asked from his position 15 feet to her left. He was not talking to her, but to Corporal Chun, who was adjusting his machine gun on its bipod. Chun took his time answering, settling the weapon and checking his ammunition belt before responding. "She did all right with Torres," he said carefully. "Handled it smooth. Professional." Garrett made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been dismissal. That was a twisted ankle, not a sucking chest wound with rounds snapping overhead. Different thing entirely. The clearing team emerged from the compound 20 minutes later, their expressions frustrated. "Dry hole," Lieutenant Baxter announced over the radio. "No cache, no weapons, no recent activity. We're moving to Rally Point 2 for extract." The platoon consolidated and began moving back toward the vehicles, following a different route to avoid creating a predictable pattern. The Taliban watched everything, learned everything, and exploited every mistake. Halfway back to the Humvees, Torres's ankle gave out completely. He tried to take a step on uneven ground, and his leg simply folded, dropping him to one knee with a sharp intake of breath. Kira was beside him immediately, supporting his weight before he could fall further. Wallace appeared on his other side, and together they kept Torres upright while he found his balance. "Need a carry?" Wallace asked. Torres shook his head stubbornly. "I can make it, Sergeant. Just need to go slower." They made it back to the vehicles with Kira and Chun supporting Torres between them, his arms across their shoulders, his weight distributed so he could hop on his good leg while they bore most of his mass. By the time they reached the convoy, Kira's shoulders burned from the strain and her lower back ached from the awkward position, but she kept her expression neutral and her breathing controlled. She helped Torres into the Humvee, then climbed in beside him to monitor him during the ride back to base. Sergeant Wallace stood outside the vehicle for a moment before they rolled out, his eyes on Kira with an expression that contained something close to grudging acknowledgement. "You did get out there," he said quietly. Then he turned and moved to his own vehicle before she could respond. The intelligence briefing 2 days later changed the atmosphere on the base. Captain Aldrich stood before the assembled platoon leaders and senior enlisted, his expression carved from stone, while a major from Battalion Intelligence pointed to satellite imagery displayed on a laptop screen. "We have confirmed increased enemy movement in the Western Canyon sector," the major said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone delivering bad news they had verified multiple times. "Signals intelligence indicates at least 2 fighting-age males with communications equipment operating from the Ridge Complex. Pattern of life analysis suggests they are coordinating ambush positions along our primary patrol routes." Lieutenant Baxter leaned forward, studying the imagery with a focused intensity that made him effective and occasionally reckless. "Recommendations?" he asked. The major glanced at Captain Aldrich before responding. "Battalion advises extreme caution on all patrols in that sector. Enhanced security protocols. No movement without air support on station. Consider alternate routes where feasible." The unspoken message hung in the room like smoke. They were being told to expect contact, to prepare for soldiers to be hurt or killed, to understand that the Taliban had been watching and planning and were now ready to act. After the briefing ended, Kira found herself standing near the operations center exit while squad leaders clustered in small groups, their voices low and serious. Staff Sergeant Vance stood with Sergeant First Class Merrick, and their conversation carried clearly in the concrete space. "Mass casualty situation in that terrain. We're looking at golden hour problems," Vance said, referring to the critical first 60 minutes for treating severe trauma. Merrick nodded slowly, his scarred face thoughtful. "Even with experienced medics, extraction times from those canyon positions are 15 to 20 minutes under ideal conditions. Under fire? Could be double that or worse." Vance's eyes found Kira across the room, and he did not bother to lower his voice. "And we're sending a medic with maybe 8 months total experience into that environment." His tone was not angry, just matter-of-fact, stating what he considered an obvious tactical error. "When the casualties start coming, she's going to have 5 soldiers bleeding out simultaneously with no way to prioritize and no backup close enough to matter." Merrick's expression remained neutral, but he did not disagree. He looked at Kira for a long moment, then turned back to Vance. "Battalion makes the calls. We just deal with the consequences." That evening, Kira sat in the transient tent, cleaning her rifle, the repetitive movements of disassembly and maintenance providing something close to meditation. Private First Class Dixon appeared in the entrance, his silhouette backlit by the fading sunlight. "You hear about the intelligence update?" he asked. She nodded without looking up from the bolt carrier group she was scrubbing. "Hard not to hear about it." Dixon stepped inside, letting the tent flap fall closed behind him. His expression was serious, lacking the casual skepticism that usually characterizes interactions with her. "Torres told me what you did for him out there," Dixon said. "Said you handled it smooth. Professional." Kira looked up, surprised by the directness. "Torres has a low bar for professional," she said. "It was a sprained ankle, not exactly advanced trauma care." Dixon shook his head slightly. "Point is you stayed calm. You knew what to do." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But a sprained ankle on a routine patrol is different from multiple penetrating traumas with insurgents putting rounds on your position. Whole different level of pressure." "I know that," she said quietly. Dixon met her eyes, and in his face she saw genuine concern rather than dismissal. "I'm not trying to be a jerk about this. I am just saying If it goes bad out there, like really bad, the kind of bad where soldiers are screaming and bleeding and dying, that is when we will know if you can handle it. And if you cannot, people die who might have lived. The words hung between them, honest and brutal, stripping away any pretense that this was about gender or politics or anything other than survival. He was telling her the truth, and the truth was that soldiers would measure her capability in blood and screams and the desperate minutes when training either held or collapsed under pressure. After Dixon left, Kira sat alone with her rifle partially disassembled and thought about the Western Canyon and what the intelligence briefing really meant. Somewhere in those brown hills, men with weapons and radios were planning violence. They were choosing positions, calculating angles, preparing ammunition, waiting for American soldiers to walk into the killing zone they had constructed. And when that happened, when the ambush was triggered and soldiers went down, every assumption about her capability would be tested in the most unforgiving way possible. The next morning brought another briefing, this one tactical and detailed. 1st Platoon would patrol the Western Canyon sector in 48 hours, a presence patrol designed to disrupt enemy planning and demonstrate that American forces would not cede terrain despite the intelligence warnings. Lieutenant Baxter outlined the route with mechanical precision, pointing to elevation changes and choke points, identifying likely ambush positions, and planning responses for each scenario. Air support would be on 15-minute standby. Quick reaction force would stage at Checkpoint Delta. Medical evacuation helicopters would orbit 30 kilometers out, ready to move on contact. Sergeant Wallace gathered 2nd Squad after the briefing, his expression grim. "This is the real thing," he said without preamble. "Not a routine patrol, not a presence operation. We are walking into terrain where the enemy has been preparing to kill us. When we take contact, and we will take contact, everyone does their job exactly as trained. No panic, no freezing, no heroes." His eyes moved across each soldier in turn, lingering slightly longer on Kira. "Thorne, you stay with me at all times. When casualties happen, I will tell you who to treat first. You do not freelance. You do not make independent decisions. You do exactly what I say. Clear?" "Clear, Sergeant," she said. Around the small circle, soldiers nodded with varying degrees of tension visible in their faces. Torres, his ankle still wrapped but functional, looked nervous. Corporal Chun checked his machine gun with extra attention, his movements methodical. Specialist Garrett stared at the ground, his jaw working as if chewing thoughts too dark to speak aloud. That night, lying in her bunk with 60 hours until the patrol, Kira listened to the sounds of the base settling into darkness. Generators hummed. Distant conversations carried on the wind. Someone laughed at a joke she could not hear. And underneath it all, the weight of knowing that in 2 days she would walk into a canyon where men waited to kill her. And when the killing started, 18 soldiers would discover whether she was capable or whether Staff Sergeant Vance and Sergeant First Class Merrick and all the others who had predicted her failure were right. The convoy rolled out at 0500 under a sky still dark with pre-dawn cold. 6 Humvees loaded with 1st Platoon, extra ammunition, and the knowledge that they were driving toward a fight that intelligence had all but guaranteed. Kira sat in her usual position in the 4th vehicle, wedged between her aid bag and the door, feeling the weight of every item she carried. Tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, chest seals, nasopharyngeal airways, pressure bandages. Each piece of equipment represented a specific injury, a specific type of bleeding, a specific way a human body could be damaged. She had trained with all of it, practiced on mannequins, and in realistic scenarios with simulated wounds and fake blood. But the soldiers sitting around her carried real blood, and in a few hours, some of that blood might be outside their bodies, pumping onto canyon rocks while she tried to remember exactly how the training sequences went. Route Sapphire descended into the Western Canyon through a series of switchbacks that made the vehicles vulnerable and slow. The Eastern Ridge rose on their right, steep and covered with loose scree that would make climbing nearly impossible. The Western Ridge was slightly lower, but equally hostile, its face broken by draws and gullies that could hide entire squads of fighters. Between the ridges, the valley floor narrowed to less than 200 meters, a natural corridor that funneled movement and limited options. Every tactical manual ever written said to avoid terrain like this, and they were driving straight into it because someone at battalion had decided that ceding this ground sent the wrong message. They dismounted at a staging point where the valley widened slightly, giving the platoon room to organize into patrol formation. Lieutenant Baxter moved among the squads with quiet intensity, checking equipment and reviewing contingency plans. Air support checked in on the radio. 2 Apache helicopters orbiting at altitude with clear fields of fire once they were called in. Quick Reaction Force confirmed ready status from Checkpoint Delta. Medical evacuation reported prepared for immediate launch. All the pieces were in place for a textbook operation, except that the enemy never read the same textbooks, and their plans rarely accommodated American preferences. Sergeant Wallace gathered 2nd Squad in the shadow of the Humvees, his weathered face serious in the growing daylight. We move out in 2 minutes. Standard tactical column. Chun, you're on point with Torres. Garrett pulls rear security. Dixon, you're on the radio. Thorne, you stay between Dixon and me at all times. His eyes locked onto hers with absolute focus. When we take contact, you go to ground immediately. You do not move until I tell you to move. You do not treat anyone until I identify them and clear you forward. If someone is screaming, they are breathing, which means they can wait. You prioritize based on my assessment, not on who is loudest. Understood? Understood, Sergeant, she said. The other soldiers in 2nd Squad exchanged glances, some skeptical, some neutral, all of them clearly wondering whether she would actually follow those instructions when bullets started flying and men were bleeding. Corporal Chun adjusted his machine gun, the weapon heavy across his body armor, then looked at Kira with an expression that mixed concern and doubt. You ever been shot at before? He asked. She shook her head. Not even close. She nodded slowly. It is loud, louder than you think, and everything happens faster than training. Just remember your job is not to be a hero. Your job is to keep people alive so they can go home. The patrol moved into the canyon in tactical silence, each soldier scanning their assigned sector, weapons held ready, spacing maintained at exactly 5 meters. The morning sun was just reaching into the valley, throwing long shadows and creating pockets of darkness that could hide anything. Kira kept her position between Dixon and Wallace, her rifle across her chest, her eyes moving between the ridgelines and the terrain ahead. Every boulder looked suspicious. Every fold in the ground suggested a firing position. The canyon was beautiful in an austere way, brown and tan and gray under a pale blue sky, but that beauty felt malicious, like it was hiding something that would reveal itself with violence. They had moved 1/2 kilometer when Wallace raised his fist, the universal signal for halt. The patrol stopped immediately, soldiers taking knee and establishing security. Wallace studied the terrain ahead with the focused attention of someone who had survived multiple deployments by noticing things that were slightly wrong. He pointed to a section of the trail where the dirt looked disturbed, then gestured for Chun to move forward and investigate. Chun approached carefully, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning for pressure plates or tripwires. After 30 seconds, he looked back and shook his head. Just loose dirt, Sergeant. Nothing buried. Wallace nodded and signaled the patrol to continue, but Kira saw the tension in his shoulders increase, saw the way his hand stayed closer to his rifle's trigger. Captain Aldrich's voice crackled over the radio from his position with 1st Squad, 200 meters ahead of 2nd Squad's location. All elements, this is Phantom 6. We have possible observation post on Western Ridge, grid 7115. Eyes on position, but no hostile action at this time. Kira looked toward the western ridge and saw nothing but rock and shadow, but somewhere up there someone was watching them, radioing their position, coordinating with fighters who were waiting for the right moment. The knowledge made her skin crawl, made every step feel like it was being measured and calculated by invisible observers who were deciding when and where to spring their trap. They continued moving deeper into the canyon, the walls rising higher on both sides until the sky was reduced to a narrow strip of blue overhead. The temperature rose as the sun climbed, turning the canyon into a furnace that made body armor feel like it weighed twice its actual mass. Kira's legs burned from the constant climbing over uneven terrain. Her shoulders ached from the weight of her A-bag. Sweat ran down her back under layers of gear. But she maintained her position and kept scanning, because stopping or slowing or showing weakness was not acceptable. Private First Class Torres, moving just ahead of her in the formation, kept glancing back toward the western ridge, his nervousness visible in the tension of his movements. "You see something?" Dixon asked quietly. Torres shook his head, just feeling watched, like there are eyes everywhere. Dixon nodded without changing expression. "That is because there are. They know we are here. They're just waiting to see if we walk into their kill zone or if we're smart enough to avoid it." Sergeant Wallace received another radio call, listened for several seconds, then moved back to where Kira walked. "The lieutenant wants us to push forward to the compound at grid 7128. Intel thinks that is where the communications equipment is operating from. We go in, we search it, we leave. Simple." But his expression suggested it was anything but simple, and when he turned back to lead the patrol forward, Kira saw him check his ammunition and adjust his rifle one more time, small movements that revealed the truth beneath his calm professional exterior. He expected contact. He expected soldiers to be hit. And when that happened, every prediction about her capability would be tested in fire and blood in the desperate seconds when training either held or shattered under pressure that no simulation could replicate. The compound at grid 7128 sat in a natural depression where the canyon floor dipped and widened, creating a bowl-shaped area that offered concealment from aerial observation but made ground approaches dangerously exposed. The structure itself was typical Afghan construction, mud brick walls surrounding a central courtyard. Most of the interior rooms collapsed from age or previous fighting. Lieutenant Baxter positioned squads in a loose perimeter while he studied the compound through binoculars, his expression unreadable in the harsh midday sun. Kira took position behind a low stone wall with second squad, her rifle pointed toward the northern approach. Her heart rate elevated not from exertion, but from a certainty that something was wrong with this entire situation. Staff Sergeant Vance moved past their position, leading third squad to a covering position on the eastern flank. He paused near Sergeant Wallace, his voice low but carrying in the still air. "This feels like a setup," he said. "Perfect kill zone. Every approach is exposed. If they wanted to hit us, this is where they would do it." Wallace nodded slowly, his scarred face tight with tension. "Lieutenant knows it too. But Battalion wants eyes on that compound, so we go look." Vance glanced toward Kira, his expression making clear what he thought about having an inexperienced medic in a position like this. "When it goes bad," he said to Wallace, "you keep her alive long enough for Merrick to get forward. She freezes up in the middle of a mass casualty. We lose people we could save." Wallace's jaw tightened, but he did not disagree. He moved back to second squad's position and gathered them close. "Listen up. Foreman clearing team is going in. We provide security from here. When contact comes, and it will come, you stay behind cover and return fire on my command. Thorne, the second anyone goes down, you wait for my signal before you move. I do not care if they are screaming. I do not care if they are bleeding out. You wait until I clear you forward, or you will be the casualty I am treating." His eyes bore into hers with absolute intensity, making sure she understood that this was not training, not theory, but the moment where obedience meant survival and initiative meant death. The clearing team moved toward the compound in tactical formation, for soldiers with Lieutenant Baxter in the lead, their movements careful and measured. They reached the outer wall without incident, stacked up at the entrance, then flowed inside with the practiced efficiency of men who had cleared hundreds of similar structures. The radio maintained a steady stream of updates, rooms being checked and reported clear, the process methodical and professional. Kira watched through the sight of her rifle, scanning the ridgelines, looking for the glint of metal or the shadow of movement that would indicate hostile observation posts preparing to engage. 3 minutes passed. Then 4. The clearing team worked through the compound's interior while the perimeter security maintained vigilant watch. Corporal Chun shifted his machine gun slightly, tracking his barrel across the western ridge where the observation post had been spotted earlier. Nothing moving, he muttered. Too quiet. Torres, positioned to Chin's right, kept glancing between his assigned sector and the compound entrance, his breathing audible, his fingers tight on his rifle's grip. Dixon monitored the radio, listening to the tactical frequency and the air support net simultaneously, ready to call and fire support the moment contact was made. Lieutenant Baxter's voice came over the radio, calm and professional. Phantom 6 to all elements. Compound is clear. No personnel. No weapons cache. Possible communications equipment removed recently. Preparing to withdraw. Kira felt a slight easing of tension in her chest, a hope that maybe this patrol would end without the violence everyone had been predicting. But Sergeant Wallace did not relax. His eyes continued scanning. His rifle remained ready, and his body language suggested a man waiting for the other boot to drop. The clearing team exited the compound in reverse order, moving back toward the perimeter with the same careful discipline they had used approaching. They had covered maybe 30 meters, still badly exposed in the depression's open ground, when the first shot cracked across the canyon. The sound was sharp and immediate, different from the movie gunfire Kira had heard all her life, more like a whip crack than an explosion. Lieutenant Baxter went down hard, his legs folding beneath him, his body twisting as he fell. For one frozen second, absolute silence hung in the air as every soldier's brain processed what had just happened. Then the canyon erupted. Automatic weapons fire poured down from 3 different positions on the western ridge, coordinated and devastating, the bullets kicking up dirt and sparking off rocks as they tore through the space where American soldiers occupied ground. The clearing team scrambled for cover, dragging Lieutenant Baxter toward a rocky outcrop, while return fire began snapping uphill toward the Taliban positions. Chin opened up with his machine gun, long controlled bursts that walked across the ridgeline, suppressing one of the firing positions. Garrett and Torres added their rifles to the volume of fire, the sound overwhelming and continuous, echoing off the canyon walls until it became a physical thing that pressed against eardrums and made thinking difficult. Kira went to ground behind the stone wall exactly as she had been trained, her face pressed against rock that smelled like dust and age, her hands covering her helmet while rounds passed overhead with sounds like angry insects. The noise was beyond anything she had imagined, beyond anything the training ranges had prepared her for, a wall of sound that made communication nearly impossible and thought fragmentary. Through the chaos, she could hear voices shouting, some calling for ammunition, some reporting targets, some screaming words she could not distinguish. Her heart hammered in her chest, so hard she could feel it in her throat, and her hands shook despite her best efforts to control them. Sergeant Wallace was beside her, his rifle barking in steady controlled pairs, his voice cutting through the noise. "Thorne, stay down. Do not move. The lieutenant is hit. Merrick is moving forward from first squad position. You wait for instructions." His tone left no room for discussion, no space for heroic impulses, just absolute command that she stay exactly where she was. Through a gap in the stone wall, she could see Lieutenant Baxter being dragged into cover by 2 soldiers from the clearing team, his leg dark with blood, his face twisted in pain, but conscious and aware. Alive. For now. The firefight continued, Americans pouring suppressive fire toward the ridge while the Taliban positions responded with disciplined bursts, conserving ammunition and maintaining their advantage of high ground. Sergeant First Class Merrick appeared from first squad's position, moving at a combat crouch with his aid bag bouncing against his back, heading toward where Lieutenant Baxter had been pulled to cover. He moved with the confidence of a man who had done this before, who knew exactly what he was doing, who represented everything Kira was supposed to be but feared she was not. Dixon keyed the radio, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Contact! Contact! Contact! Grid 7128. Troops in contact. 1 urgent surgical. Request immediate air support and medical evacuation." The response came back crisp and professional. Apaches inbound 2 minutes. Medevac launching now. ETA 15 minutes. 2 minutes felt like an eternity. 15 minutes felt like forever. And somewhere in the chaos and noise and fear, Kira pressed herself against the stone wall and wondered if Staff Sergeant Vance and Sergeant First Class Merrick and all the others who had predicted her failure were watching her prove them right. The Apache helicopters arrived with a sound like ripping canvas, their rotors beating the air as they swept over the ridgeline and began engaging the Taliban positions with chain guns that sounded like industrial machinery tearing metal. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The incoming fire from the western ridge slackening as fighters abandoned their positions or died in place under the withering accuracy of aerial weapons. But the damage was already done. Lieutenant Baxter was down with a femoral wound that Sergeant First Class Merrick was working frantically to control. And somewhere in the chaos, another call came over the radio that made Kira's blood freeze. Man down, man down. Third squad position. Specialist Garrett hit. Urgence surgicale. Need medic now. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Vance, and underneath his professional tone was an edge of desperation that cut through the battlefield noise like a knife. Sergeant Wallace grabbed the radio from Dixon. Merrick is with Phantom 6. Where's your position? Vance responded immediately. Eastern flank, behind a boulder cluster. Garrett took rounds to the chest and abdomen. He is bleeding bad. Real bad. We need help now. Wallace looked toward Merrick's position, saw him still working on Lieutenant Baxter with both hands inside the wound, saw the amount of blood on the ground around them, and made a decision. He turned to Kira, his scarred face tight with the knowledge of what he was about to do. Thorne, you are up. Third squad position, eastern flank. Go now. Move fast but stay low. The words hit her like a physical impact, cutting through her fear and her doubt, and the small voice in her head that said she was not ready for this. But there was no time for fear now, no space for doubt, just the simple fact that a soldier was dying and she was the only medic available to save him. She grabbed her aid bag and moved, staying low like Wallace had ordered, her boots finding purchase on loose rock as she scrambled across 50 meters of exposed ground toward third squad's position. Rounds were still snapping overhead, fewer now, but present enough to make every step feel like it might be her last. The distance seemed infinite, every meter stretching into miles, her breath coming hard and fast inside her chest. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the weight of her aid bag pulling at her shoulders, could taste dust and fear in her mouth. She reached the boulder cluster and found third squad pressed into whatever cover they could find, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, their eyes showing the strain of sustained combat. Staff Sergeant Vance was crouched over Specialist Garrett, his hands pressed against Garrett's chest, blood seeping between his fingers in a steady flow that meant the wounds were bad. Really bad. Garrett's face was pale, his breathing rapid and shallow, his eyes showing awareness but also the beginning of shock. When Vance saw Kira, his expression showed surprise mixed with doubt, but he moved aside to give her access. He is yours, Vance said. Do not let him die. Kira dropped to her knees beside Garrett and went to work, her training taking over in a way that pushed fear into the background and brought forward the sequences she had practiced 1,000 times. She cut away his body armor and uniform top with trauma shears, exposing 2 entry wounds in his right chest and 1 in his upper abdomen, all of them bleeding but not spurting, which meant no major arterial involvement but definite penetration of the thoracic cavity. Garrett tried to speak, but she put a hand on his shoulder. Save your energy. I have got you. Just breathe for me. She pulled a chest seal from her aid bag and applied it over the largest chest wound, creating an occlusive barrier that would prevent air from entering the pleural space and collapsing his lung further. Garrett gasped as the seal went on, his breathing slightly easier but still labored. She checked his neck veins, saw they were not distended, ruled out immediate tension pneumothorax. Then she moved to the abdominal wound, packing it with hemostatic gauze that would promote clotting, her hands steady despite the chaos around her, despite the sound of gunfire still echoing off canyon walls. despite knowing that every second counted and that mistakes meant death. Staff Sergeant Vance watched her work, his expression shifting from doubt to something approaching disbelief. "You have done this before?" he said, the statement coming out like a question. "Only on mannequins," she replied without looking up, her attention completely focused on Garrett's injuries. She started in 4-line in his left arm, her needle finding the vein on the first attempt despite his decreasing blood pressure, then hung a bag of saline to maintain volume while his body tried to compensate for blood loss. Garrett's eyes found hers, showing fear and pain and a desperate need to believe she knew what she was doing. "You're going to be fine," she told him, her voice steady and certain even though the clinical part of her brain was calculating survival probabilities and finding them less than optimal. "The medevac is 7 minutes out. You just need to hold on for 7 minutes. Can you do that for me?" Garrett managed a small nod, his breathing still rapid, but more controlled now that the chest seal was working. 7 minutes, he whispered. "I could do 7 minutes." The Apache helicopters made another pass, their guns tearing into a Taliban position that had tried to relocate and re-engage. The sound was apocalyptic, drowning out everything else for 5 seconds, then fading as they banked away to reposition. In the relative quiet that followed, Kira completed her primary survey, checking circulation and checking for additional wounds she might have missed in the initial chaos. Garrett was stable. Not good, but stable. Alive. Still alive. Corporal Chun appeared at the edge of their position, his machine gun slung across his back, his face showing the strain of sustained fire. "How is he?" Chun asked. Vance looked at Kira, letting her answer. "Stable for now," she said. "Needs surgical intervention within the golden hour, but he will make it to the bird." Chun's expression shifted to something like respect, his eyes moving from Garrett to Kira and back again. "You did good," he said quietly. "Real good." The radio crackled with an update from the medevac helicopter. "Dust-off 37 is 2 minutes out. Prepare casualties for immediate extraction." Wallace's voice came next, directing the helicopters to the only landing zone within reasonable distance, a flat section of canyon floor 200 meters north of their current position. "All elements prepare to move casualties to LZ on my mark. We bound by squads with continuous covering fire." Vance looked at Kira. "Can he move?" She assessed Garrett's condition, his blood pressure still marginal, but holding, his breathing controlled by the chest seal, his consciousness maintained. "If we carry him," she said. "He cannot walk, but we can carry him." Vance nodded and called 2 soldiers forward. Private First Class Torres and another soldier from 3rd Squad positioned themselves on either side of Garrett, preparing to lift him in a controlled carry that would minimize movement and protect his injuries. Kira stayed close, one hand on the forebag, ready to monitor him during the movement. The sound of the approaching helicopter grew louder, the distinctive whop-hop-hop of rotor blades cutting through smoke and dust. The noise was salvation, the promise of surgical intervention and blood transfusions, and a sophisticated medical technology that could save lives that would have been lost in any previous war. Wallace's voice cut through the radio traffic. "All squads, execute bound to LZ. Move now." 3rd Squad lifted Garrett and began moving north, staying low, maintaining cover where possible, the entire platoon providing suppressing fire to keep Taliban fighters pinned while casualties were extracted. Kira moved with them, her hands steady on the 4-line, her eyes on Garrett's face watching for signs of deterioration. The 200 meters felt like 2 miles, every step precious, every second critical. But Garrett held on. His breathing stayed controlled. His consciousness remained. He was going to make it. They were going to make it. The medevac helicopter touched down in a maelstrom of dust and rotor wash, its crew chief already leaning out with a litter ready before the skids fully settled on the rocky ground. Kira and the carrying team rushed Garrett forward, heads down against the propeller blast, moving as fast as the uneven terrain allowed. The flight medic took one look at Garrett's chest seal and 4 placement, nodded once in professional acknowledgement, then helped transfer him onto the litter with movements that spoke of countless similar evacuations. Within 30 seconds, Garrett was secured inside the aircraft, the flight medic already reassessing vitals and preparing for immediate intervention if his condition deteriorated during flight. Within 45 seconds, the helicopter was lifting off, banking hard to the east, its turbines screaming as it climbed away from the canyon and toward the surgical hospital of Bagram, where Garrett's survival would ultimately be determined. Lieutenant Baxter went out on the same bird, Sergeant First Class Merrick riding with both casualties to maintain care during the flight. That left 1st Platoon with no officer, no senior medic, and an enemy force that had been suppressed but not eliminated. Captain Aldrich's voice came over the radio from battalion headquarters, calm and authoritative despite the situation. Phantom 6 Actual is down. Phantom 5, you have command. Consolidate your position and prepare for extract. QRF is moving to your location. ETA 12 minutes. Staff Sergeant Vance, the most senior NCO remaining with the platoon, acknowledged and immediately began organizing the defensive perimeter while they waited for reinforcement. The Taliban had withdrawn from their positions on the western ridge, either killed by the Apache gun runs or smart enough to disappear before the Americans could call in artillery. But withdrawal did not mean surrender, and everyone knew the fighters could be repositioning for another attack, waiting for the helicopters to leave so they could engage again with small arms or RPGs. The platoon established hasty fighting positions in a tight defensive circle, every soldier scanning their sector, ammunition redistributed from casualties to those still in the fight. The Apaches continued orbiting overhead, their presence a deterrent but not a guarantee, their fuel limited and their time on station running short. Kira found herself positioned with 2nd Squad again, her aid bag lighter now after using supplies on Garrett, but still containing enough equipment to treat additional casualties if the situation deteriorated further. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her breathing had returned to something approaching normal. But her mind kept replaying the last 20 minutes in fragments, the sound of rounds snapping overhead, the feeling of Garrett's blood on her hands, the weight of knowing that her actions had determined whether he lived or died. She had done it. She had treated a critical trauma patient under fire and kept him alive long enough for evacuation. The realization felt distant and unreal, like it had happened to someone else, and she had only observed from a distance. Sergeant Wallace moved through the perimeter, checking each position, his rifle ready, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. When he reached 2nd Squad, he crouched beside Kira and looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before. "That was good work back there," he said quietly. "Real good work. Garrett is alive because of you." The words carried weight, coming from a man who had questioned her capability from the moment she arrived, who had given her explicit orders to stay down and wait for instructions, who had been preparing to watch her fail. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and Wallace squeezed her shoulder once before moving on to check the next position. Corporal Chun shifted his machine gun slightly, tracking his barrel across the western ridge where smoke still rose from the Apache strikes. "You surprised a lot of people today," he said without looking at her. "Vance was laying bets you would freeze up. $50 said you would not even make it to Garrett's position before breaking down." Kira felt a spike of anger cut through her exhaustion. "And what did you bet?" she asked. Shin glanced at her, his expression serious. "I did not bet. I figured I would wait and see what you could actually do before I made assumptions." He paused, then added, "Glad I waited. You proved everyone wrong who said you could not handle it." Private First Class Torres, positioned to Chin's right, turned partially toward their conversation. "My ankle is still wrapped from when you fixed it on that first patrol," he said. "I watched you work on Garrett. Same steady hands, same focus, different scale, but same competence." He shook his head slowly. "Half the squad thought you were going to be a liability, thought having a female medic in combat was some kind of political statement that was going to get people killed. But you just saved Garrett's life while rounds were still flying. That shut everyone up real quick." The quick reaction force arrived in a convoy of vehicles that announced their approach with dust clouds visible from half a kilometer away. Fresh soldiers dismounted and established expanded security, while the battered 1st Platoon prepared to withdraw from a position that had cost 2 casualties and nearly cost more. Staff Sergeant Vance gathered the squad leaders for a quick brief, his voice carrying exhaustion and relief in equal measure. We move in 5 minutes. Bounding withdrawal with continuous cover. 3rd Squad has point. 2nd Squad brings up rear. Stay alert. They hit us once, they can hit us again. The squad leaders dispersed to prepare their soldiers, and the machinery of tactical withdrawal began. During the movement back to the vehicles, Kira walked near the center of 2nd Squad's formation, her legs burning from exertion and adrenaline crash, her mind processing what had happened in disconnected fragments. Specialist Garrett's pale face. The sound of the chest seal being applied. Staff Sergeant Vance's expression shifting from doubt to something approaching respect. The flight medic's professional nod. Lieutenant Baxter being loaded onto the helicopter. All of it felt simultaneously vivid and distant, real and impossible, like a memory from someone else's life that she had temporarily inhabited. They reached the vehicles without further contact, loaded up in reverse order of their insertion, and began the slow, careful drive back toward forward operating base Phoenix. The convoy maintained tactical spacing and vigilant watch, but the immediate threat had passed. Taliban fighters had withdrawn to count their own casualties and plan their next attack. The Americans had survived another patrol in the most dangerous valley in Afghanistan, at a cost of 2 urgent surgical casualties and the illusions of soldiers who had predicted failure from someone who had instead delivered competence under the worst possible circumstances. Kira sat in her usual position in the 4th Humvee, wedged between her aid bag and the door, watching the canyon walls slide past as they climbed out of the valley floor. Corporal Chin sat across from her, his machine gun resting across his knees, his expression thoughtful. "You know what the hardest part is?" he asked. She looked at him, waiting. He continued, "The hardest part is not the first time you do it. The first time you're running on training and adrenaline and you do not have time to think. The hard part comes later, when you have time to process what happened and realize how close it was. How many things could have gone wrong? How much luck was involved in addition to skill? That is when some people break down. That is when you find out if you can do it again. Can you?" she asked. She nodded slowly. 5 times now. 5 times I have been in firefights and had to do my job while people were trying to kill me. It does not get easier, but you learn to function anyway. You learn to push the fear down and do what needs doing. He met her eyes with something close to camaraderie. You did it once. Proved you can handle it. Now you just have to prove you can do it again. And again. Until your deployment ends and you go home and spend the rest of your life remembering. The convoy rolled through the gates of forward operating base Phoenix as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Soldiers dismounted with the careful movements of people who had been tense for hours and were only now beginning to relax. Weapons were cleared. Gear was stowed. Debrief was scheduled for 1800 hours. But before any of that, before the formal processes of after-action review and incident reporting, soldiers gathered in small groups and talked about what had happened, about Lieutenant Baxter and Specialist Garrett, about the ambush and the firefight, and the new medic who had done what half the platoon predicted she could not do. Kira heard fragments of conversations as she walked toward the transient tent. "Did you see her? Steady as hell. Garrett would be dead without her. Maybe we were wrong about her. Maybe she can actually handle this." She reached her bunk and sat down heavily, her body registering exhaustion that adrenaline had temporarily masked. Her hands were still stained with dried blood. Her uniform smelled like smoke and dust and fear. And somewhere inside her chest, underneath the exhaustion and the stress and the weight of what she had done, was a small seed of confidence that had not existed before this day. She had been tested in fire and had not broken. The doubt was still there, would probably always be there, but now it competed with knowledge earned through the most unforgiving teacher possible. The debrief lasted 2 hours, every detail of the ambush examined and recorded, every decision questioned and analyzed. Captain Aldrich attended via secure video link from battalion headquarters, his expression grave as he listened to Staff Sergeant Vance described the engagement from initial contact through final extraction. Lieutenant Baxter's condition was stable, the femoral wound repaired, and no major complications expected. Specialist Garrett was in surgery, the prognosis guarded but optimistic, his survival attributed directly to immediate and competent trauma care under fire. When Vance mentioned combat medic Thorne's performance, the captain's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been surprise or recalculation, as if he was adjusting previous assessments based on new data that contradicted expectations. After the debrief ended, Kira found herself walking across the base toward the aid station where Sergeant First Class Merrick had returned from Bugram. She needed to restock her aid bag, replace the supplies used on Garrett, ensure she was prepared for whatever came next. The sun had set completely now, the base operating under blackout conditions with only red-filtered lights marking essential pathways. Generators hummed in the darkness. Distant conversations carried on the wind. Somewhere a radio played music too faintly to identify. The normal sounds of a forward operating base at night, sounds that had seemed alien 6 days ago, but now felt almost familiar. Merrick was in the aid station organizing supply inventories when she entered. He looked up from his clipboard, his scarred face unreadable in the red-tinged light. "Heard you did good work today," he said without preamble. Garrett made it through surgery. Doctors said another 5 minutes of bleeding, and he would have coded before reaching the hospital. Your chest seal and hemostatic packing bought him the time he needed. The words were factual, delivered without particular warmth, but also without the subtle skepticism that had characterized his previous interactions with her. "I just did what I was trained to do," she said. Merrick nodded slowly, setting down his clipboard. That is what everyone says after their first real trauma. Just following training. But training is not the same as performance under pressure. Half the medics I have seen freeze up their first time under fire, even with good training. He did not freeze. That counts for something. He pulled supplies from the storage locker and began helping her restock her aid bag, his movements efficient and practiced. You proved you can handle the basic work. Stabilize a casualty. Control bleeding. Maintain airway. Good fundamentals. But, Kira asked, hearing the unspoken qualifier in his tone. Merrick met her eyes directly. But one successful trauma does not make you a combat medic. It makes you someone who did not fail when it mattered. The real test is consistency. Can you do it again tomorrow? Can you do it under worse conditions? Can you handle multiple casualties simultaneously when there's not enough time and not enough supplies, and you have to make decisions about who gets treated first and who has to wait? He paused, letting the weight of those questions settle. Today you had one critical patient and enough time to work methodically. Real mass casualty events do not give you that luxury. The words stung because they were true. She had performed well under pressure, but the circumstances had been almost ideal for a single casualty scenario. Garrett had been the only critical patient requiring her attention. Merrick had been handling Lieutenant Baxter. The tactical situation had allowed her time to work without being overrun. But combat did not guarantee favorable conditions, and the Taliban could easily create scenarios where multiple soldiers went down simultaneously and she would have to make impossible choices with insufficient resources. That capability remained unproven, and until it was proven, doubt would persist. 2 days passed in relative calm, patrols continuing but without major contact, the Taliban either regrouping after their losses or planning something larger. Kira spent the time training with Merrick, running through mass casualty scenarios, practicing triage decisions, learning the brutal calculus of battlefield medicine, where saving one life sometimes meant accepting that another would die. Merrick was not gentle in his instruction, pushing her to make faster decisions, to trust her assessments even when they felt uncertain, to accept that perfect information was a luxury combat never provided. "You will make mistakes," he told her during one training session. "You will lose patients you might have saved if you had done something different." That reality breaks some medics. The ones who survive learn to carry it and keep functioning anyway. On the 3rd day after the ambush, intelligence reported increased enemy activity in the northern canyon sector, a different area from the previous contact, but equally dangerous terrain. Captain Aldrich called a commander's brief that included all platoon leadership and senior medical personnel. "The Taliban are probing our response patterns," he said, gesturing to a map that showed recent contact locations. "They hit us in the west. We reinforce western patrols. They shift attention north. They're trying to find weak points in our coverage and create opportunities for successful ambushes. We need to maintain presence across the entire area of operations, which means we cannot avoid high-risk patrols just because we took casualties." Staff Sergeant Vance spoke up from his position near the map. "Sir, we're down one medic with Baxter's evacuation. That leaves Merrick and Thorne covering the entire company's operations. If we take multiple casualties across different platoons simultaneously, we do not have the medical coverage to handle it." The statement hung in the air, a tactical reality that everyone understood, but no one wanted to articulate. They were operating with reduced capability in the most dangerous area of Afghanistan, and the enemy knew it. Captain Aldrich looked at Merrick. "Your assessment of our medical readiness?" Merrick's response was immediate and blunt. "We are capable but not optimal. Thorne performed well under fire, but she is still inexperienced in complex triage scenarios. If we take mass casualties across multiple locations, I cannot be everywhere simultaneously. We will lose soldiers we might save with additional experienced medical personnel." The captain nodded slowly, acknowledging the limitation without offering solutions that did not exist. Battalion was aware of the shortage. Replacement medics were identified but not yet available. Until reinforcements arrived, they would operate with what they had and accept the increased risk. That evening, Kira found herself on the North Tower for guard duty. The same shift she had pulled on her second night at the base, when everything was new and frightening and uncertain. But now the base felt different, or maybe she felt different about it. Her perspective shifted by combat and blood and the knowledge that she had been tested and had not failed. Corporal Chun climbed the tower stairs near the end of her shift, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had been reheated so many times they tasted more like bitter petroleum than anything resembling actual coffee. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing her one of the cups. They stood together in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the dark mountains that surrounded the base on 3 sides. "You hear about the northern sector?" Chun asked eventually. Kira nodded. "Intel says they are planning something up there. We're going out tomorrow." He sipped his terrible coffee, his expression thoughtful in the darkness. "You know what Vance said after the debrief the other day? After he got done with the official report?" She shook her head. Chun continued. "He said you were steady. Said he had been wrong about his prediction that you would freeze. Said if he had to go into a bad situation, he would trust you to keep him alive if he got hit. Coming from Vance, that is about the highest compliment possible." The words carried more weight than Kira expected, warming something inside her chest that had been cold since she arrived. But Chun was not finished. He turned to face her directly, his expression serious. "Tomorrow is going to be bad. Northern sector is worse terrain than where we got hit before. More places to hide. Harder extraction routes. If they hit us there, it is going to be messy. Multiple casualties likely. You need to be ready for that. Ready to make the hard calls Merrick was talking about. Ready to live with the decisions you make when there is no good option." She met his eyes and saw genuine concern mixed with something approaching friendship. "I will be ready," she said, hoping it was true, knowing that tomorrow would reveal whether that confidence was earned or simply desperate optimism in the face of certain violence. The Northern Canyon was everything intelligence had promised and worse. The terrain rose in jagged vertical walls on both sides, creating a corridor so narrow that the patrol moved in single file, every soldier acutely aware that withdrawal under fire would be nearly impossible. Rocky outcroppings provided countless positions for observation and ambush. The valley floor was littered with boulders the size of vehicles, creating a maze that channeled movement and eliminated options. First Platoon moved through this nightmare landscape with weapons ready and nerves stretched tight, every soldier understanding that if the Taliban had chosen this location for an attack, Americans would die before extraction was possible. Kira moved in the middle of second squad's formation, her aid bag heavy against her back, her her rifle held ready, but feeling inadequate against terrain that gave every advantage to defenders. Sergeant Wallace led the squad with the careful attention of a man who had survived too many patrols in places like this by noticing details that others missed. He paused frequently, studying the ground and the ridge lines, looking for signs of disturbance or preparation. Behind Kira, Private First Class Torres maintained rear security, his movements more confident than on previous patrols, his ankle fully healed, and his trust in her capability established through evidence rather than assumption. The radio traffic was sparse and professional, squads reporting positions and negative contact. The tactical operations center monitoring their progress through tracking systems and overhead assets. Apache helicopters orbited at high altitude, conserving fuel while maintaining overwatch capability. Medevac birds sat on standby at Bagram, crews ready but hoping they would not be needed. All the pieces were in position for a textbook operation, but textbooks did not account for enemy forces who had been planning and preparing and waiting for exactly this moment. They were 3 kilometers into the canyon when the world exploded, not gradually like the previous ambush, not with a single shot that provided warning, but with a coordinated detonation of multiple improvised explosive devices that erupted simultaneously across a 100-meter stretch of the patrol route. The blast wave hit like a physical wall, sound and pressure and heat combining into something that knocked soldiers off their feet and turned the narrow canyon into a hellscape of smoke and dust and screaming. Kira went down hard, her helmet slamming against rock, her vision going white for several seconds before awareness returned in fragmentary pieces, ringing in her ears. Smoke so thick she cannot see 3 meters. People shouting words she could not distinguish. The taste of blood in her mouth from biting her tongue. She forced herself to her feet, her aid bag somehow still attached to her back, her rifle lost somewhere in the chaos. The dust began to clear slightly, revealing a scene from nightmares. The patrol had been shattered by the blasts, soldiers scattered across broken ground, some moving and some terribly still. Automatic weapons fire poured down from both ridges, coordinated and devastating, the Taliban triggering their ambush at the moment of maximum American vulnerability. Bodies lay in the kill zone, some struggling to reach cover, some not moving at all. The radio was chaos, multiple voices trying to report simultaneously, calls for medevac competing with contact reports and casualty counts that kept climbing. Sergeant Wallace appeared through the smoke, blood running down the side of his face from a laceration across his scalp, his expression showing controlled fury and tactical calculation. "Thorne, we have at least 6 down. Maybe more. Merrick is with 1st Squad, 200 meters forward. You're the only medic for everyone behind that position. Triage fast and start treating." His words cut through her shock like a blade, bringing focus to chaos, transforming overwhelming horror into a series of specific tasks that training had prepared her to execute. She moved toward the nearest casualty, a soldier from 3rd Squad whose legs had been shredded by shrapnel, his screaming audible even over the gunfire. She dropped beside him and started working, tourniquet on the right leg where the femoral artery was pumping blood onto rocks, her hands moving through the sequence automatically while her mind categorized and prioritized. Critical but stabilizable. She placed the tourniquet and twisted the windlass until bleeding stopped, then moved immediately to the next casualty without waiting to see improvement. No time for monitoring. No time for reassurance. Just rapid assessment and critical intervention before moving on. The second casualty was unconscious, a massive head wound that made her heart sink even as her hands checked for pulse and breathing. No pulse. No respiratory effort. Pupils fixed and dilated. She marked him with a black tag torn from her aid bag, the brutal calculus of triage requiring that she move past soldiers who could not be saved to focus on those who still had a chance. The decision felt like murder, but hesitation would guarantee more deaths. So she pushed the guilt down and kept moving, kept assessing, kept making choices that would haunt her forever, but kept others alive. 3rd casualty had a sucking chest wound and was struggling to breathe, his lips turning blue from hypoxia. She applied a chest seal while rounds snapped overhead. Her body crouched low, but her hands steady, then moved on before seeing if the intervention was sufficient. Fourth casualty had an abdominal wound, bleeding but not immediately life-threatening. Hemostatic packing applied in 30 seconds, then on to the next. Fifth casualty was screaming about his arm, but she saw the injury was peripheral, painful, but not lethal. She kept moving, searching for casualties who were dying right now versus those who could survive long enough for secondary treatment. Staff Sergeant Vance appeared beside her, his rifle firing controlled bursts toward the eastern ridge, providing covering fire while she worked. "How bad?" he shouted over the noise. "Bad," she shouted back. "I count 5 critical that need immediate evacuation. At least 3 more with serious wounds that can wait. 1 Kia." The words came out clinical and detached, her mind forcing emotional distance from the reality of what those categories meant. Soldiers she had lived with, trained with, who had names and families and futures that were being measured in categories like critical and expectant and killed in action. Corporal Chun was on his back 20 meters away, his machine gun beside him, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Kira reached him and found blood spreading across his torso from multiple shrapnel wounds, his body armor shredded by the blast that had caught him in the open. His eyes found hers, showing pain and fear and desperate hope that she could fix this. She cut away his uniform and assessed rapidly. 3 penetrating wounds to the chest and abdomen, bleeding controlled by his body armor until she removed it, now flowing freely and requiring immediate intervention. Chen tried to speak, but she silenced him. "Save your energy. I have got you. Just breathe." She worked faster than she had ever worked, chest seals on 2 of the wounds, hemostatic packing in the abdomen, for lines started and fluids running. Chen's breathing eased slightly, his color improving marginally, enough that she could move to the next casualty knowing he would survive the next 10 minutes. The medevac call-out went over the radio, Dixon's voice steady despite circumstances. "Multiple urgent surgical. Request immediate medical evacuation. LZ is too hot. Cannot extract from current position. Need alternate extraction point." The response came back grim. "Medevac cannot land under fire. Suppression required before birds will approach." The tactical problem was obvious and unsolvable. Casualties needed immediate evacuation, but helicopters would not risk crews and aircraft while enemy fire remained effective, which meant suppressing or eliminating the Taliban positions, a task that would take time casualties did not have. Private First Class Torres appeared at her side, his rifle slung and his hands ready to help. "What do you need?" he asked. She looked at the casualties spread across broken ground, the soldiers who needed movement to the extraction point that did not yet exist, the bleeding that continued despite her interventions. "Help me move Chun," she said. "We need to consolidate casualties in better cover." Torres nodded, and together they lifted Chun, his weight distributed between them, carrying him toward a cluster of boulders that provided protection from the eastern ridge. Other soldiers were doing the same, gathering wounded into a defensive perimeter while the unwounded provided covering fire. Sergeant Wallace was organizing the evacuation, his voice cutting through chaos with absolute authority. "All mobile casualties move to Rally Point Alpha. All immobile casualties will be carried. We bound by squads with continuous suppression." Chun, despite his wounds, tried to smile at Kira. "Told you the hard part was doing it again," he said, his voice weak but still carrying that edge of dark humor that soldiers use to cope with horror. "You're doing good. Real good. Keep going." She wanted to tell him to shut up and conserve energy, wanted to break down and cry, wanted to demand that someone explain why this kept happening. But there was no time for any of that, just the next casualty and the next intervention and the desperate hope that she could keep enough of them alive long enough for evacuation to be possible. The consolidated casualty collection point sat in the partial shelter of a boulder field, offering some protection from direct fire, but still exposed to the elevated positions that the Taliban controlled. Kira moved among the wounded with systematic efficiency, reassessing each casualty in order of priority, adjusting treatments as conditions changed, making the continuous calculations that determined who lived and who died. The soldier with the leg tourniquet was stable, his bleeding controlled, and his consciousness maintained. Chin's chest wounds had stopped bleeding externally, but she worried about internal hemorrhage that she could not address in the field. The chest wound patient was breathing easier with the seal in place, but his oxygen saturation was dropping, suggesting tension pneumothorax that would require needle decompression if they did not evacuate soon. Apache helicopters made gun runs against the ridgeline positions, their cannons tearing into Taliban fighters with devastating accuracy. Each pass bought seconds of reduced, incoming fire, brief windows when soldiers could move casualties or reposition without immediate threat of being cut down. But the enemy was dug in and determined, continuing to engage despite losses, committed to inflicting maximum damage before being overrun or killed. The tactical situation was deteriorating, ammunition running low among the platoon, casualties mounting, and extraction still not possible until the landing zone could be secured. Sergeant Wallace gathered squad leaders for a rapid tactical decision. The LZ needs to be 300 meters north at the valley opening. Only place helicopters can land in this terrain. We need to suppress both ridges simultaneously and bound our way there with the casualties. He looked at each man, his scarred face showing the weight of command in crisis. This is going to cost us, but staying here costs more. Everyone understood what he meant. Moving 300 meters under fire while carrying wounded would result in additional casualties. But remaining pinned in a kill zone with limited ammunition and deteriorating medical situations guaranteed worse outcomes. Staff Sergeant Vance took charge of the movement plan, assigning squads to bounding elements and casualty-carrying teams. Thorne, you move with the casualties. Chun cannot walk. Neither can the leg tourniquet patient. We need you with them to maintain treatment during movement. Kira nodded, already mentally cataloging what interventions she could perform while being carried or moving and which would require full stops. The chest decompression patient worried her most. If his tension pneumothorax progressed during movement, she would need to perform a needle decompression in the middle of a firefight, a delicate procedure that required precision and stillness that combat environments did not provide. The movement began with 1st Squad laying down suppressive fire on both ridges, while 3rd Squad bounded forward 50 meters with half the casualties. Rounds snapped overhead and impacted around them, close enough that dust kicked up from near misses. But the volume of American return fire forced Taliban fighters to stay in cover rather than taking aim shots. Kira moved with the carrying team, transporting Chun, one hand on his chest monitoring his breathing, the other maintaining his foreline, her legs pumping to keep pace with soldiers who were running while carrying a wounded man and full combat loads. They reached the first bound and went to ground while 2nd Squad leapfrogged past them with the remaining casualties. Private First Class Torres was carrying the leg tourniquet patient in a fireman's carry, his young face set with determination, his movements strong despite the weight. Specialist Dixon provided covering fire from behind a boulder, his rifle barking in steady rhythm, his rounds forcing an enemy position to stop shooting long enough for casualties to pass. The coordination was imperfect but effective, born from training and desperation in equal measure, every soldier understanding that this was the difference between going home and being left behind. Halfway to the landing zone, the chest decompression patient's condition crashed. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his neck veins distended, his oxygen saturation plummeting as air trapped in his pleural space compressed his heart and prevented his lungs from expanding. Kira called for a halt, ignoring the ongoing gunfire, focusing entirely on the needle decompression kit in her aid bag. She found the anatomical landmark between his ribs, felt for the correct intercostal space, then inserted the needle with controlled pressure until she felt the pop of penetrating the pleural space. Air hissed out under pressure, the tension releasing immediately, and the soldier's breathing eased within seconds. His color improved. His consciousness returned. The entire procedure took 45 seconds that felt like hours, every moment aware that she was stationary in a combat zone, performing a procedure that required absolute precision. Staff Sergeant Vance had watched the entire intervention from his covering position 10 meters away. When she finished and signaled ready to continue, he keyed his radio. All elements, the medic just performed a field decompression under fire. That patient lives because she refused to let him die. His voice carried a tone she had never heard from him before, something beyond respect, approaching awe. When they resumed movement, soldiers looked at her differently, their expressions showing recognition that she was not just competent, but exceptional, not just capable of following protocol, but willing to stop in the middle of a firefight to perform a life-saving procedure that most medics would have deferred until reaching safety. The landing zone finally appeared ahead, a relatively flat section where the canyon opened slightly, enough space for 2 helicopters to land simultaneously. Quick Reaction Force had arrived and was establishing defensive positions, their fresh soldiers providing the firepower necessary to suppress enemy positions long enough for evacuation. The first medevac bird touched down in a storm of dust and noise, its crew chief waving urgently for casualties. Kira helped load Chun first, then the decompression patient, then the leg tourniquet case, each one transferred with rapid efficiency to flight medics who would continue care during transport to surgical hospitals. The second helicopter took the remaining critical casualties, 7 soldiers total going out on 2 birds. The worst of the wounded, now racing toward operating rooms where trauma surgeons would determine final outcomes. But Kira's work was not finished. 3 more soldiers had moderate wounds requiring treatment. A dozen others had minor injuries from blast fragments and flying debris. She moved among them, applying bandages and checking vital signs, ensuring that less critical injuries did not deteriorate while attention had been focused on the dying. Sergeant First Class Merrick appeared from First Squad's position, his uniform dark with someone else's blood, his expression showing the strain of handling his own mass casualty situation forward of the main element. He found Kira treating a soldier with a laceration across his forearm, her hands steady as she irrigated the wound and applied a pressure dressing. "Heard you did a field decompression in the middle of a firefight," he said without preamble. "That is advanced level care under worst possible conditions." His eyes studied her with an intensity that felt like evaluation, like he was measuring something he had previously doubted. "You saved at least 4 lives today. Maybe more. That is the definition of a combat medic." The word should have felt like victory, like validation of everything she had worked for and fought to prove. But standing in a canyon littered with blood and spent brass and the evidence of violence, all she felt was exhaustion and the weight of the soldier she had marked with a black tag, the one whose face would join her nightmares for however long memory lasted. Corporal Chun had said the hard part was doing it again. He had not mentioned that doing it well enough to save lives meant carrying the faces of those you could not save forever. The patrol consolidated at the landing zone, ammunition redistributed, casualties evacuated, and a defensive perimeter established while they waited for convoy extraction back to forward operating base Phoenix. Soldiers sat in small groups, some talking quietly, some sitting in silence, all of them processing what had happened in the ways that soldiers process trauma. Some through dark humor, some through focus on equipment maintenance, some through the 1,000-yard stare that suggested they were seeing things no one else could see. Private First Class Torres approached Kira where she sat checking her remaining medical supplies. "Remember that first patrol?" he asked. "When I twisted my ankle and you treated it like it was no big deal." She nodded, too tired for words. Torres continued, "I thought you were just okay, competent enough. But today I watched you run through a firefight to treat casualties. I watched you stick a needle in a guy's chest while rounds were snapping overhead. I watched you make decisions about who to treat first that I could never make." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're not just okay. You're the best medic I have ever seen. And I'm sorry I ever doubted you." The convoy arrived as twilight settled over the canyon, shadows growing long and the temperature dropping with the disappearing sun. First platoon loaded into vehicles with the heavy movements of people who had survived something they should not have survived, who had lost friends and seen horrors, and would carry those images forever. Kira sat in her usual position in the fourth Humvee, her aid bag nearly empty of critical supplies, her uniform stained with blood from multiple casualties, her hands still steady despite exhaustion. As the convoy began the slow climb out of the northern canyon, she looked back one final time at the valley floor, where 7 soldiers had nearly died and where her actions had determined that most of them would live to see their families again. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing and necessary and permanent. The price of being the person who stood between soldiers and death in the worst places humans created for killing each other. Forward Operating Base Phoenix felt different when the convoy rolled through the gates that night. Or maybe Kira felt different about it, her perspective fundamentally altered by what had happened in the Northern Canyon. Soldiers dismounted with the careful movements of people processing trauma, their faces showing exhaustion and relief and the complicated emotions that came with surviving when others had not. The Base Operations Center was already coordinating casualty reports with battalion headquarters, updating status boards with names and conditions, the bureaucratic machinery of war documenting violence in clinical terminology that stripped away blood and screaming and left only statistics. Captain Aldrich met the convoy at the motor pool, his presence unusual and significant. He moved among the soldiers with quiet words of acknowledgement, then approached Sergeant Wallace for a detailed brief. Kira watched from a distance while restocking her aid bag at the aid station, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind remained partially in the canyon, replaying decisions and second-guessing choices and cataloging the faces of soldiers whose lives had depended on her competence. She heard fragments of Wallace's report, heard her name mentioned multiple times, heard the captain asking specific questions about the field decompression and the triage decisions and a number of lives saved through immediate intervention. When Wallace finished his report, Captain Aldrich walked directly to where Kira stood organizing medical supplies. "Combat Medic Thorne," he said formally, and she came to attention out of instinct. At ease. He studied her for a long moment, his weathered face showing something she had not seen before. Respect. Unmistakable and hard-earned. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "When you arrived at this base, I offered you a transfer because I believed you were not prepared for this operational environment. I was wrong. What you did today, what you have done consistently under the worst possible conditions, represents the highest standard of combat medicine I have seen in 22 years of service." His words carried weight, coming from a man who had questioned her capability from the first day, who had offered her an escape route because he expected her to fail. "Thank you, sir," she managed, not trusting herself to say more without her voice breaking. The captain continued, "Specialist Garrett is out of intensive care. Corporal Chun is stable and expected to make full recovery. The leg tourniquet patient retained full function of his limb because your tourniquet placement was textbook perfect. The chest decompression patient would have died without your intervention. According to the trauma surgeons at Bagram, your field care was flawless. You gave them patients who were already stabilized rather than casualties who were actively dying. That level of performance saved lives that we would have lost with lesser medics." The words should have felt like victory, but Kira kept seeing the face of the soldier she had marked with a black tag, the one whose injuries had been beyond field intervention, who had died while she moved on to treat others who still had a chance. Captain Aldrich seemed to read her thoughts. "You made the correct triage decisions under impossible circumstances," he said quietly. "The soldier you could not save was already gone when you reached him. Nothing you could have done would have changed that outcome. But your decision to move on to salvageable casualties meant that 7 others survived. That is the burden of battlefield medicine. You carry the ones you lose while knowing that hesitation would have cost more lives." Sergeant First Class Merrick appeared in the aid station entrance, his expression serious but showing something approaching approval. "Captain wants to put you up for the Combat Medical Badge," he said to Kira, "also recommending you for an Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device for your actions under fire." The recognition felt distant and unimportant compared to the weight of what she carried. But she understood that medals and badges were the military's way of acknowledging service that defied easy description, of marking moments when soldiers exceeded expectations and embodied the standards their profession demanded. That evening, 1st Platoon gathered informally near the living quarters, soldiers sharing stories and processing the day's events in the way that combat veterans had processed trauma for generations. Kira found herself included in conversations that she would have been excluded from 2 weeks ago, soldiers seeking her out rather than avoiding her, asking questions about treatment decisions and tactical medicine with genuine interest rather than skepticism. Staff Sergeant Vance approached with a beer he had somehow acquired despite regulations, offering it to her with a crooked smile. "I owe you $50, he said, and an apology. I bet against you. Predicted you would freeze under fire. I have never been happier to lose money." Corporal Chun was still at Bagram undergoing additional treatment, but he had sent a message through the casualty evacuation chain, relayed by a flight medic who had transported him. "Tell Thorne she saved my life, and I owe her everything. Tell her she is the best combat medic in this entire war, and anyone who says different is an idiot." The message was pure Chun, mixing gratitude with profanity and absolute sincerity, and when soldiers repeated it to her, their expressions showed they agreed with his assessment. Private First Class Torres sat beside her during the informal gathering, his presence comfortable rather than awkward. Their relationship transformed from skeptical squad member and untested medic to something approaching friendship born from shared danger. "You know what the hardest part is going to be?" he asked. "Going home eventually and trying to explain to people what this was like. Trying to make them understand why it matters that you saved lives in a place most people could not find on a map." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The gap between those who had experienced combat and those who had not was unbridgeable through words, explainable only through shared experience that civilians would never have and soldiers could never fully articulate. Sergeant Wallace found her later that night, after most soldiers had drifted to sleep or to whatever solitary processing their minds required. "I never doubted your training," he said without preamble. "I doubted whether training would hold under pressure, whether you could make the hard calls when lives depended on it. You proved you can. More than that, you proved you could do it better than most." He paused, his scarred face thoughtful in the darkness. "The platoon trusts you now, completely. That trust is earned, not given. You earned it in blood and fire. That means something." The words settled into a space inside her chest that had been hollow since arriving at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, filling it with something that felt like belonging, like acceptance, like the recognition that she was not just a medic who happened to be female, but a combat medic who had proven capability under the worst circumstances warfare could create. The doubt was still there, would probably always be there, the voice asking whether she was good enough, strong enough, capable enough. But now that doubt competed with evidence, with faces of soldiers who were alive because of her actions, with the transformed perspectives of men who had predicted her failure and witnessed her success. 3 days later, word came through official channels that Specialist Garrett had been discharged from the hospital and was beginning physical rehabilitation. Corporal Chun would remain at Bagram for another week, but was expected to make full recovery. The leg tourniquet patient had retained complete function and was already asking when he could return to duty. The chest decompression patient was stable and recovering. 7 casualties evacuated from the Northern Canyon, 6 surviving to return home to families who would never fully understand how close death had come and how a combat medic they had never met had stood between their loved ones and permanent loss. Captain Aldrich called a formation to present the Combat Medical Badge, a simple ceremony in the dusty space between buildings. First Platoon assembled in loose ranks while the captain read the citation and pinned the badge to her uniform. The badge itself was metal and cloth, nothing remarkable in appearance, but it represented recognition from soldiers who understood exactly what it meant to earn it. When the formation dismissed, soldiers who had doubted her, who had bet against her, who had predicted her failure, approached with handshakes and acknowledgments and the simple acceptance that came from shared experience in places where pretense died and truth revealed itself through action. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about your favorite moment or character, or tell us about a combat medic you know who showed extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. The Northern Canyon would see more patrols, more violence, more casualties. The Taliban would continue fighting, continue setting ambushes, continue testing American resolve in terrain that favored defenders and punished mistakes. But combat medic Kira Thorne would face those dangers with platoon members who no longer questioned her capability, who trusted her completely, who knew from direct experience that she would run in a fire to save them and possess the skill to keep them alive when death seemed certain. The weight of that responsibility would never feel light. The faces of those she could not save would never fade, but she would carry it anyway because that was what combat medics did. They stood between soldiers and death in the worst places humans created for killing each other, and they refused to let death win without a fight that cost everything they had to give.